Let's dive right into this explainer. Between 1491 and 1607, the Spanish Empire didn't just conquer North America with weapons. They conquered it with a highly engineered social structure. Today, we're unpacking the foundational scaffolding of colonial power. If you really want to understand the mechanics of empire building in this era, you can't just look at maps and dates. You have to look at the people, how they were categorized, and how those categories fueled an entire hemispheric economy.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We're going to cover shaping the Spanish Empire, move into the Encomienda and forced labor systems, examine the transatlantic slave trade, unpack the colonial caste system, and finally, look at some primary documents and divergent worldviews. Okay, starting off with part 1, shaping the Spanish Empire. So the absolutely crucial point here is that understanding the Spanish Empire requires analyzing how they created and strictly maintained specific social categories to drive their economic goals. They didn't just show up and start extracting resources, right? They built a highly structured society from the ground up to make that extraction possible. Government policy, culture, and day-to-day colonial lives were entirely dependent on the specific roles assigned to different groups of people. Social structure wasn't just a byproduct of the empire, it was the engine that actually made the empire run. Moving right along to part 2, Encomienda and forced labor. Now, the Encomienda system, this wasn't just a suggestion, it was a strict mandate. The Spanish crown explicitly granted colonizers the right to marshal Native American labor to extract precious metals and support these massive plantations. In return, the colonizers were supposedly meant to protect them and convert them to Christianity. But in practice, it was a brutal economic system designed from the very top down to pull unimaginable wealth from the earth using entirely forced labor. To see how this actually played out on the ground, we can look at a fascinating primary source from 1585 Mexico called the Directorio para Confesores. This document was actually a training manual for priests. You see, the church was deeply integrated into the colonial administration, and confessors were the ones dealing with the moral, ethical, and legal realities of the encomienda system on a daily basis. Notice the very specific language used in this training exercise. By officially referring to the colonizers as lords who hold temporal government and Native Americans as vassals, the document is formalizing a strict hierarchy. It shows us that this wasn't just random chaos or unofficial exploitation. It was a highly formalized, bureaucratically justified system of control heavily documented by the institutions of the time. Which brings us to part 3, the transatlantic slave trade. As native populations tragically declined from disease and brutal working conditions, the empire had to pivot to feed an economy that was just intensely hungry for labor. European traders formed partnerships with West African groups who already practiced forms of slavery. From there, individuals were forcibly extracted and shipped across the Atlantic. The Spanish specifically imported these enslaved Africans to sustain and wildly expand those incredibly profitable plantation and mining operations we were just talking about. And it's important to realize this wasn't some underground operation. It was official royal policy. Consider this correspondence from the King of Portugal to the King of Congo. Having a European monarch directly orchestrate and discuss the export of enslaved people proves this was a state-sanctioned, highly organized global enterprise. The highest levels of power were literally engineering the movement of human beings for economic gain. Let's shift into part 4, the colonial caste system. Okay, so how do you manage this highly diverse collision of Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans? Well, the Spanish created a carefully defined caste system. They needed a way to organize society to protect their power and maintain supreme economic efficiency. So they entrenched a rigid social structure based on heritage and race that legally dictated a person's rights, the taxes they owed, and the exact labor they were obligated to perform. This system explicitly categorized populations to dictate their specific economic roles. You had Europeans sitting at the top holding government and temporal power. Native Americans were legally defined as vassals bound to the Encomienda, and Africans were designated as forcibly enslaved laborers. Every single person had a defined status, and that status dictated their entire existence within the empire. This was the exact blueprint of the Spanish colonial engine in action. And finally, part 5, documents and divergent worldviews. This 1513 document, El Requerimiento, perfectly captures the brutal absurdity of imperial policy. Conquistadors were ordered to read this legal document aloud to Native Americans, demanding total submission to the Spanish crown and the church. The catch? It was read entirely in Spanish to populations who didn't understand a single word of it.
Yet it effectively served as the foundational legal justification for conquest and the implementation of those strict systems we've been exploring.
When you start to connect the dots between these documents and the realities on the ground, the whole matrix of the empire really reveals itself. The text of El Requerimiento wasn't just an abstract speech. It laid the exact legal groundwork for the Encomienda and caste systems. The written policy gave official permission for the practices that governed colonial lives, proving that the empire's vast economic systems totally relied on formal, documented decrees to operate.
So we are left looking at two profoundly divergent worldviews experiencing the exact same historical moment. For the Spanish, it was a highly structured worldview of legalistic conquest, marshaled labor, and strict categorization to build an empire. But for the indigenous peoples, it was the devastating reality of being suddenly forced into an oppressive, alien economic machine governed by laws they never agreed to and decrees they couldn't even understand.
As we wrap up our explainer on the Encomienda, the transatlantic slave trade, and the caste system, I want you to consider this. How does a single piece of paper, read aloud on a beach in an unrecognizable language, encapsulate an entire clash of civilizations? The mechanics of empire aren't just in the weapons, are they? They're in the words and the laws. Ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, how do the legal and social categories we create shape the reality we are forced to live in?